It was a quiet evening when I first said it, almost like a passing thought, but it came out so suddenly, I wasn't sure how it would land. What if you took a week for yourself? I asked my wife, her tired eyes glancing up from the book she was reading. She blinked, almost as if she hadn't heard me correctly. We'd been in routine for years, always busy, always together, always doing what we had to do. But somewhere along the way, it felt like we'd both forgotten what it was like to just breathe without the weight of responsibilities hovering over us. At first, she looked confused, unsure whether I was serious. It wasn't like me to suggest something so drastic, and truthfully, I didn't know what made me say it. I had noticed her growing quieter lately, withdrawing into herself, as if carrying a burden she couldn't share. Maybe it was the endless tasks of daily life, or the fact that we hadn't really taken time for ourselves in years. I saw it all, the subtle stress, the exhaustion she couldn't hide anymore. The thought of her being away, living independently, seemed like the perfect chance for both of us to hit the reset button. I wanted her to have that freedom, the space. But I didn't know what that would mean for our relationship. Would she come back refreshed? Or would the time apart make us see each other differently? I couldn't shake the question, the curiosity of what would happen if we both took a moment to step outside the box we'd built together. When I asked her again, her response was slower this time, like she was really thinking about it. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice hesitant but intrigued. It was hard to read her, but the uncertainty in her eyes made me wonder if she was relieved by the idea or terrified. The silence between us grew heavy as she thought it over, and I couldn't help but feel like something big was about to change, even though neither of us knew exactly what it would be. The day she left was quiet, almost too quiet. I watched her pack a small bag, the kind she always used for short trips, and felt a strange mixture of emotions. It was only for a week, I kept telling myself, but as the hours passed, I realized it wasn't just the absence of her physical presence that was unsettling. It was the silence that filled our home. The house seemed too big, too empty, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. She had left that morning, after a soft kiss on the cheek, a few lingering words, and a promise to call when she could. There was no drama, no arguments, just a decision. But I could tell it wasn't easy for her either. She kept checking the time, asking if I was sure about the whole thing. "Are you sure this is okay?" She'd asked more than once, her tone a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. I tried to reassure her, but inside, I wasn't sure myself. Was I doing the right thing? Would a week apart really help? Or would it just drive a wedge between us that we wouldn't be able to fix? The moment she walked out the door, it hit me. She was really gone. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to think about what she needed, where she was, or if she was okay. She was free to do whatever she wanted without having to explain it to anyone. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one holding the schedule, the plans, the list of things to do. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and an unsettling kind of loneliness. The house felt too big, and the air around me felt different, almost too quiet. I tried to keep myself busy, working through some tasks that had been on my to-do list for weeks. But it wasn't the same without her around. I'd catch myself expecting her to walk into the room or hear her voice calling my name from the other side of the house. Instead, there was just nothing. I sat down on the couch, the empty space beside me where she usually sat now glaring at me. I couldn't help but wonder if this would be good for us. This space. What would it do to our relationship? Would she come back and be the same, or would I be looking at someone completely different? I texted her a few times during the day, just checking in. It was strange not having her there to talk to face. She responded each time, always cheerful, but I could sense the distance in her words, the quiet excitement she had about being alone, about living life without any expectations for once. I began to realize that this wasn't just a break for her. It was a chance to rediscover parts of herself she hadn't had time for in years. She was free from everything that had tied her down in our shared routine. By the time night fell, I was left with my thoughts, the weight of what we had done sitting heavily on my chest. I thought about her, alone in some new place, doing whatever she felt like, and I wondered if I could ever do the same. Was I ready for the kind of freedom she was experiencing? Or had I been so caught up in the responsibilities of our life that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be myself without any strings attached? I spent the evening with my thoughts, my mind racing with the possibility of what was to come. I hadn't expected the loneliness to hit so hard, and I hadn't expected to feel so uncertain. What would happen after this week? Would we come back together and feel more connected? Or would the time apart create a divide that we couldn't cross? There was no way of knowing, but one thing was certain. Everything had changed. The first day without her was strange. In the hours that followed her departure, I found myself constantly looking at the clock, waiting for the day to pass quickly. It felt like I was on some kind of pause, stuck between what was and what was yet to come. I had imagined this day would feel like freedom, like I could finally do whatever I wanted. But instead, it felt like an empty space, a void I didn't know how to fill. I spent the morning cleaning up the house, something I hadn't done in a while. I wasn't doing it for any particular reason, just filling time, trying to distract myself from the fact that she was out there living her life without me. I wiped down counters, tidied up the living room, but it didn't feel the same without her presence. I kept thinking about her. What was she doing? Was she enjoying the time alone, or was she missing me just as much as I was missing her? I tried not to overthink it, but the questions kept piling up. I texted her again just to check in. Her reply came quickly. I'm at the park. It feels good to just breathe, you know? I stared at the message for a moment, feeling a small pang in my chest. I had never really thought about what it must be like for her. What it would feel like to take a step back from everything, to live for yourself without having to answer to anyone. I didn't realize how much she had been holding on her shoulders until now. Her words hit me differently than I had expected, and suddenly, I didn't feel as alone as I did before. But then, something else hit me. It was as if the idea of her being out there, free and unburdened, stirred up a strange mix of emotions inside me. I felt a bit jealous. She was out there, doing whatever she wanted, and here I was, stuck in a routine that felt too familiar. There were so many things I could have been doing, places I could visit, things I could experience. But somehow, the weight of my own responsibilities kept me tethered to the same old routine. I went for a walk, trying to shake the feeling that had settled in my chest. It was a nice day, warm with a gentle breeze, and the streets were calm. I walked for what felt like hours, lost in thought. I thought about her, how different she must feel being alone for the first time in years. I imagined her sitting in a cafe, watching people pass by, feeling free from all the obligations that had once been our life together. I couldn't help but picture her smiling, carefree, enjoying the moment. That evening, I sat down at dinner alone, the silence in the house louder than it had ever been before. The empty seat across from me felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't just a lack of conversation. It was the absence of everything we usually shared in that space. The laughter, the little moments of connection, the comfortable routine of sharing a meal together. I texted her again. How's your day going? I asked, trying to keep things light, even though I was dying to know what she was up to. Her response came quickly. It's amazing. I never realized how much I needed this. I'm sitting by the water, watching the sunset. It's peaceful. I couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and sadness. Admiration for the fact that she had taken this time for herself, and sadness because I had no idea how much she had needed it. I had been so focused on the day-to-day that I hadn't noticed how overwhelmed she was. It was like I had been living in a bubble, not fully understanding what she needed until now. As I finished my dinner alone, I reflected on the day. It was supposed to be about freedom, about space, about rediscovering ourselves. But what I hadn't expected was how much it would make me realize about my own life, how much I had taken for granted. I had always thought of our relationship as something that required constant closeness, constant togetherness. But now I was beginning to understand that maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe what we both needed was space. Space to grow, space to breathe, space to rediscover who we were outside of each other. By the time I went to bed, the house felt even quieter than it had in the morning. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing, spinning with the thoughts of what the next few days would bring. Would she come back and feel like a different person? Would I? Would we be stronger after this break? Or would the distance between us grow too wide to bridge? As the night settled in, I couldn't help but feel the pull of something bigger than just a week apart. This wasn't just about a break. It was about rediscovery, about learning to let go of the things that held us together so we could come back stronger. But I still wasn't sure how all of this would play out. By the middle of the week, things had shifted in ways I didn't expect. The initial shock of being alone had worn off, replaced by a curious sense of detachment. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. There was a strange kind of peace to it, almost like I was living in a quiet pause, waiting for something to unfold, something I didn't fully understand yet. But as the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes in both myself and her. We were learning to live in the silence, to embrace the space that had suddenly opened up between us. It wasn't just her absence that had changed things, though. It was the way I was seeing everything around me. I had always thought of myself as a person who thrived on routine, who preferred stability and predictability. But in this time of separation, I found myself questioning everything. What did I really want? What had I been so focused on for the last few years that I hadn't even noticed how much I had been neglecting my own needs? I spent a lot of time reflecting on my own habits, my own life outside of the relationship. There was no one around to interrupt my thoughts, no one asking what I was doing or when I'd be home. For the first time in years, I had the freedom to think about who I was when I wasn't playing the role of a husband, a partner, or a provider. It was both liberating and unsettling, like I was waking up from a long, foggy dream. I remembered things I used to enjoy before we got so busy, like reading books that weren't about self-improvement or planning the next big thing. I started picking up old hobbies, like playing guitar, something I hadn't done in years. It felt strange, almost foreign at first, but by the end of the week, I realized how much I had missed these parts of myself. But it wasn't just about me. I couldn't stop thinking about how she was doing. The more I heard from her, the more I realized this wasn't just a break for her. It was a revelation. She was discovering parts of herself that I hadn't even known were there. Her text started to shift in tone, less about what she was doing, more about how she was feeling. At first, her messages had been simple updates. Went for a walk in the park, had a coffee at a new cafe. But by midweek, they began to delve deeper. One evening, she sent me a message that made my heart skip a beat. I'm sitting by the ocean, watching the waves. I never realized how much I've been holding in. It's like I can breathe again. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to process what she had just said. It wasn't just a physical space she was enjoying. It was an emotional space, too. She was releasing something I hadn't even known was there. For years, I had seen her as the steady one, the calm in the storm, but now I was beginning to understand how much pressure she had been under. I had always been so focused on my own role in the relationship, on being the one who was working hard, planning for the future, taking care of everything, that I hadn't realized how much she was carrying, quietly, without asking for anything in return. She hadn't just been managing a household or supporting me. She had been managing herself, too, and I hadn't even noticed. I thought back to all the little signs I had missed. The tiredness in her eyes, the way she often looked like she was just going through the motions, the way she never seemed to take time for herself. I had chalked it up to life, to the usual stress everyone faces. But now, in this quiet, disconnected space, I realized how much she had been sacrificing. Not just for me, but for herself, too. I didn't tell her this right away. I wasn't sure how to express it, how to admit that I had been so wrapped up in my own world that I had failed to see hers. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her for taking this time, for showing me something I needed to see. She wasn't just my partner. She was an individual in her own right, someone with needs, desires, and dreams I hadn't fully understood until now. The more she shared with me, the more I realized how much I had been missing out on. She was living her life, discovering pieces of herself that had been buried under years of compromise. It was as though she was being reborn in this short span of time, shedding the old skin of responsibility and obligation, and embracing a version of herself that had been dormant for too long. One night, as I was going over some old journals I had found tucked away in a drawer, I received another text from her. I'm so glad we did this. I feel like I'm learning how to be me again, how to just exist without having to explain it. Her words hit me harder than I expected. In the midst of this time apart, she was learning to just be. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. This wasn't just about her needing a break. It was about both of us learning to let go of the expectations we had placed on each other and on ourselves. We had been so focused on what we should be doing, what we should expect from each other, that we had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in our own space, without any pressure to perform or fulfill a role. I started to realize how important it was for both of us to have this space, not just for her to find herself, but for me, too. This break was teaching me how to slow down, how to listen more closely to my own needs, and how to let go of the constant drive to be more, do more. I wasn't the only one learning in this experience. We both were. By the end of the week, I found myself looking forward to the changes that were unfolding. I knew our relationship would be different after this. But I also knew that these changes weren't just about us. This was about two people coming back to each other stronger, more whole, and more in tune with who they really were outside the roles they had played for so long. We were both rediscovering ourselves, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what we needed all along. The last day of her week away was approaching, and I could feel the anticipation building in me, but it was laced with an odd sense of uncertainty. I had spent the last few days reflecting on everything, on how we both changed in this brief time apart, how I had started to see things in a new light. But even with all this personal growth, I still wasn't sure what to expect when she came back. Would we be different? Would it feel like the same relationship, or would something have shifted permanently? I had no way of knowing for sure. The night before she was set to return, I didn't sleep much. I kept imagining all the ways this could play out. Would we be able to pick up where we left off, or would there be an awkwardness between us, like strangers trying to find their way back to each other? I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew I was eager to see her, to hear her voice, to feel the familiar warmth of her presence. The next morning, I woke up early and went about my day like usual, but there was a nervous excitement in me that I couldn't shake. It felt like the calm before a storm, but not in a bad way, just in the sense that something was about to change. The clock seemed to tick louder than usual, and every little noise in the house felt amplified, like I was waiting for something to happen. When her text finally came, it was simple, but it hit me with a rush of emotion. "I'm on my way back. Can't wait to see you." I looked at the screen for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. She was coming home. The time apart was over, and soon we would be face to face again. But this time, I wasn't sure if we were still the same people who had kissed each other goodbye a week ago, or if we had changed in ways we couldn't yet understand. I spent the next few hours trying to prepare myself, not for her return, but for what I expected might be a different version of us. We had learned things about each other and ourselves that we couldn't undo, and I couldn't ignore the fact that the week had shifted something fundamental in both of us. When I heard the sound of the car pulling into the driveway, I froze. I had prepared myself to be ready for a new her, someone who had found herself in the silence of the week. But when I opened the door, I found her standing there, looking just like she always had. She was smiling, but there was something different about it, something more genuine. It wasn't the forced smile she had sometimes worn when she was trying to mask how she felt. It was real, free. Her eyes met mine, and for a second we just stood there, taking each other in. I felt this wave of relief wash over me, but also a hint of uncertainty. We were both standing at the threshold of something new, and I wasn't sure what that would look like. She stepped inside, and we embraced, holding on a little longer than usual. It was quiet at first, but not the uncomfortable kind of silence. It felt like we were both trying to read each other, try to find our footing in this new space we had created apart. "So," I said, pulling back slightly to look at her, "how was it?" She smiled again, a little wider this time. It was incredible. I didn't realize how much I needed that time. It's like I've been holding my breath for so long, and now I can finally exhale. There was something about her words that made my heart swell. She wasn't just talking about the trip or the time away. She was talking about something deeper, about all the things she had been holding inside for so long. And in that moment, I realized that this week wasn't just about her finding space to breathe. It was about both of us finding space in our relationship. It was about the freedom to grow, to evolve, and to reconnect in ways we hadn't thought possible. We sat down together, And she started telling me all about her week, how she had spent her days wandering through new places, meeting people, and reconnecting with parts of herself she hadn't seen in years. But as she spoke, I noticed something else. She wasn't just talking about the activities or the places she had visited. She was talking about herself, about how she had reawakened parts of her personality, parts of her soul that had been buried under the weight of responsibilities for so long. And then she turned to me, her expression softening. "I've been thinking about us too," she said, "about what this week has taught me, about what we both need and what I need. I think we've both been so caught up in everything else that we've forgotten how to live for ourselves, for each other, without all the noise around us." Her words hit me like a wave. It was as though she was speaking directly to something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. I had been so focused on the relationship, on keeping everything together, that I hadn't noticed the cracks forming in the foundation. This week apart had allowed us both to step back and see the bigger picture, the parts of ourselves we had been neglecting, the things we had forgotten about each other. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were both on the same page. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people who had found their way back to themselves, and in turn, back to each other. We didn't have all the answers yet. There was still much to figure out, and I knew that this wasn't a one-time fix. But as we sat there, talking and laughing like we hadn't done in months, I realized that this week apart hadn't created distance between us. It had drawn us closer, making us more aware of who we were and who we wanted to be together. When we finally went to bed that night, it felt like we had entered a new chapter, one where we weren't just partners, but two people who had found their own space and were now ready to navigate this journey together, stronger and more connected than before. As the days passed since her return, I found myself reflecting more and more on the week we had spent apart. At first, it had seemed like a bold experiment, something we both needed but couldn't quite articulate at the time. But as we settled back into our routine, I began to see just how profound that time had been. It was more than just a week of physical separation. It was a week of emotional distance that allowed us to rediscover parts of ourselves that had been lost in the noise of our everyday lives. We had both learned things about each other, about ourselves, and about the space we needed to grow. I hadn't expected the change to feel so real. At the time, I had thought it would be something temporary, something that would fade once we returned to our old rhythms. But it wasn't like that at all. Something had shifted, and it wasn't something that could be undone. The first thing I noticed was how differently we started communicating. Before, our conversations had often been focused on logistics, the things we needed to do, the plans we had to make. But now, we were talking about feelings, about our experiences during the week, about things we hadn't said in years. It felt like we were finally speaking the same language, one of vulnerability and honesty. The surface-level exchanges had been replaced with deeper, more meaningful conversations. It wasn't that we had changed who we were. It was more like we had peeled away the layers we had accumulated over time. What was left was something more authentic, more real. I could see it in her eyes. There was a clarity there now, a sense of peace that hadn't been present before. She seemed more at ease with herself, like she had rediscovered parts of her that had been dormant for too long. And it wasn't just her. I felt it in myself too. I had spent so long caught up in our routine, in what I thought was expected of me, that I had forgotten what it felt like to just be, to breathe without any pressure, without any responsibility hanging over me. It was as if this space had given me permission to be free of my own expectations, to take a step back and remember who I was before all the roles I had taken on. We began to realize that the time apart had given us a new kind of strength, not one based on dependence, but on independence. The space had allowed us to grow separately, to find our own footing, and that made us stronger as a couple. It was like we had built a stronger foundation, one that wasn't just about being together all the time, but about understanding and respecting each other's individual needs. We had learned that sometimes the best way to bring two people closer together is to give them the space to grow on their own. As we continued to talk about our experiences, it became clear that the week away had allowed her to tap into a well of emotions she hadn't realized she was holding back. She told me about moments when she had felt overwhelmed by the demands of our life, when she had wished for more time to herself but hadn't known how to ask for it. It wasn't just a physical exhaustion she had been feeling. It was an emotional weight of constantly being in caretaker mode, of always being the one who made sure everything was running smoothly. She had needed this time to herself, not just for her own mental health, but for the sake of our relationship as well. For years, I had been so focused on what we needed to do together, on building a life, on creating memories, that I hadn't noticed how much we were sacrificing in the process. I had thought that being constantly together was the answer to everything. But in the absence of constant togetherness, we had learned how to live in harmony with our own individual desires. She had learned to listen to her own needs, to step away from the demands of our life, and I had learned to listen to mine. It was a revelation for both of us. I started to realize that we had both been guilty of losing ourselves in our roles as partners. We had become so enmeshed in each other's lives that we had forgotten how to nurture our own individual identities. The space we had taken allowed us to reestablish that balance, to remember who we were outside of our roles as a couple, and to return to each other with a deeper understanding of what we each brought to the relationship. In the days following her return, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. I was no longer worried about what the time apart had done to us. I realized that the change wasn't something to fear. It was something to celebrate. We had learned to be individuals again, and in doing so, we had become stronger as a couple. The pressure to always be together, to always be on, had lifted, and in its place was a new kind of freedom, one that allowed us to be our true selves, both together and apart. It wasn't just about the week, though. It was about the realization that we didn't need to constantly be together to make our relationship work. We needed time apart, time to breathe, time to grow, and time to remember who we were before we were a couple. The week apart had created the space for both of us to rediscover the person we were before the marriage, and that allowed us to return to each other with a clearer, more genuine sense of connection. In the weeks that followed, we started to build new habits, ones that included time for ourselves. We no longer saw taking time apart as a threat to our relationship, but as an opportunity for growth. We made a conscious effort to communicate better, to give each other the space we both needed to thrive. We learned that sometimes the best way to strengthen a relationship is not by being glued to each other, but by allowing each other the freedom to be our authentic selves. The week apart had shown us something we never expected, that love doesn't have to mean constant closeness. Sometimes it means giving each other the freedom to grow, to be alone, and to rediscover the things that make us whole. In doing so, we found a deeper, more meaningful connection, one that allowed us to love not just each other, but ourselves too. The days that followed our week apart were filled with a sense of quiet optimism. It wasn't the kind of optimism that was loud or brash, but rather a soft, steady kind that seeped into every corner of our daily life. The tension that had once been a constant companion in our relationship was gone. Instead, there was a new rhythm, a flow that allowed us to be ourselves individually and together in ways we hadn't imagined possible before. We had learned to give each other space, but not in the way we had before, out of frustration or neglect, but in a way that was intentional. We didn't need to be fused together at every moment to prove that we loved each other. There was a quiet understanding that sometimes the best way to love was to give each other room to breathe. And in that space, we began to see things we hadn't noticed in the years before. I started to appreciate the small moments more. Before, I had always been so caught up in the rush of life, in the never-ending list of tasks and responsibilities, that I had forgotten how precious the little things were. The way she smiled when she looked at me, the way she hummed softly to herself when she was cooking dinner. Those tiny, seemingly insignificant moments became treasures in our newly redefined relationship. We weren't just partners. We were two people who had learned to see each other, truly see each other, without the weight of expectation or routine clouding our vision. We also started talking more openly about the future. In the past, our conversations had been dominated by logistics, what we had to do, where we needed to go, what we had to plan next. But now, we were talking about our dreams, our aspirations, the things we wanted to achieve not just as a couple, but as individuals. There was a newfound freedom in these conversations, one that wasn't weighed down by a sense of obligation. We realized that we didn't have to sacrifice our own goals to support each other's. Instead, we could grow together, in parallel, each of us chasing our own dreams while supporting the other along the way. One of the biggest changes was how we approached time together. We weren't just filling the silence anymore, try to avoid feeling distant. Instead, we learned to enjoy each other's company in a deeper, more meaningful way. When we were together, it was intentional. We sought out new experiences, things we hadn't done in a long time, trying new restaurants, going for spontaneous walks, or simply spending time in silence, reading next to each other. It was in those moments that we realized how much we had missed the simplicity of just being together, without any pressure to perform or be something else. Our weekend became something we both looked forward to, but in a way that didn't carry the weight of expectation. There were no grand plans or overwhelming to-do lists. Instead, we simply enjoyed each other's company, giving each other the space to be who we were without any rush. Sometimes we would talk for hours. Other times we'd enjoy a quiet evening with a movie or a walk to the park. It wasn't about doing more. It was about appreciating the time we had, without distractions. And when things got tough, as they inevitably did, we had a new way of handling it. Instead of letting stress build up and become a point of contention, we started to talk about it more openly. There was no more pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. If one of us was feeling overwhelmed, we would acknowledge it and make room for that feeling. If we needed time to ourselves, we would ask for it without guilt. It wasn't about creating more space. It was about understanding that sometimes we all need a little space to recharge and reset. We no longer saw it as a threat to our relationship, but as a necessary part of maintaining our individual well-being. The most important thing I took away from that week, though, was how much I had underestimated the power of freedom within a relationship. I had always thought that love meant constant closeness, constant togetherness. But I now saw that the healthiest relationships are not built on suffocation, but on trust, respect, and space. We had learned to love not just each other, but ourselves. We had learned that loving each other doesn't mean losing yourself in the process. There were moments when I looked back on that week and wondered how we had come so far so quickly. I had always believed in love, but now I saw that love wasn't just about grand gestures or shared dreams. It was about the small things, the quiet understanding that we each had a right to our own lives, our own experiences, and our own happiness. And by honoring that, we were able to build something stronger, something that would last, because it was based not on dependence, but on mutual growth. We both knew that life wouldn't always be easy, and that there would be times when we would slip back into old patterns. But we also knew that the lessons we had learned during that week apart would stay with us forever. They had given us a new foundation, one that was built on communication, self-awareness, and mutual respect. We had learned to be better versions of ourselves, both for each other and for ourselves. As we moved forward, there was no longer a fear of losing ourselves in each other. We had found a balance, and it felt right. I knew that no matter what life threw at us, we had the tools to face it, together, but still as individuals, with all the space and freedom we needed to grow. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. Looking back on that week apart, I realized it was a turning point in our relationship, a moment that allowed us to rediscover not just each other, but ourselves. We had been so caught up in the day-to-day grind, in the roles we played, that we had lost sight of things that made us individuals. The space we created allowed us to step away from everything and gain a clearer perspective on what really mattered. It wasn't about the time spent apart. It was about what we did with that time. We learned to appreciate each other in new ways, not by being constantly attached, but by giving each other room to breathe and grow. The separation wasn't a wedge. It was a bridge. It allowed us to see each other not as an extension of ourselves, but as separate, complex individuals with dreams, desires, and needs that deserved attention. The changes that followed were subtle but profound. We became better listeners, better communicators, and more supportive partners. Our connection deepened, not because we forced it, but because we allowed it to happen naturally. We found joy in the little moments again, the quiet mornings, the spontaneous conversations, the shared silences. And, most importantly, we learned that love doesn't need to be suffocating to be real. It thrives when there's mutual respect, trust, and the freedom to be ourselves. Of course, the journey isn't over. Relationships require ongoing effort, growth, and understanding. But the lessons we learned during that week apart remain at the core of what makes us strong. We don't just love each other. We respect each other's space, dreams, and individuality. And in doing so, we've created something that is far more fulfilling and lasting than I ever thought possible. Ultimately, that week showed me that sometimes the best way to move forward is to take a step back. And in that space, we found a stronger, healthier version of ourselves and our relationship. The freedom we gave each other wasn't just about a break. It was about building a foundation for future, one that allows both of us to thrive, together and apart.